There are over 17,500 museums within the United States, welcoming over 850 million visitors each year. Did you ever wonder what goes on behind the scenes in museums, creating the displays and exhibits we all enjoy? Join us as we explore museums and their exhibits from the inside out. Hi, I'm Leslie Mueller. Welcome to Museum Access, the show that takes you behind the scenes at America's top museums. We're in northern Manhattan, in Fort Tryon Park at the Cloisters Museum, home to an extraordinary collection of art and architecture from medieval Europe. This New York landmark opened its doors in 1938. With sweeping views of the Hudson River, it's considered an island of serenity in Manhattan. Today we'll learn about the fascinating history of the Cloisters, beginning with one man's determination to bring his personal collection of historical monuments to America to create a medieval museum for all to enjoy. We'll view world-class collections of sculpture, paintings, tapestries, architecture, and much more. And we'll get a tour of a medieval garden, ancestor to our own backyard gardens. Then we'll take a behind-the-scenes peek at the Cloisters work area, where the horticultural team keeps all of the medieval gardens in top shape. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so are you ready to step back into the Middle Ages? Let's go. So what can someone expect to see if they come here to the Cloisters?
Well, the first thing really is that sense of being transported in time and place. It's hard to imagine that you're actually on the island of Manhattan when you're here.
You're so right.
And in terms of the collections, I mean, the core experience is one that's architectural. And then in addition to that, you can see really most of the major art forms that were produced during the Middle Ages. Stained glass, one of the really wonderful things about the Cloisters is that all of our stained glass is lit by natural light. So you're seeing it the way that it was really meant to be seen. We have sculpture, we've got goldsmith work, ivories, precious materials, manuscripts that are hand painted on parchment, which is the way that books would have been made up until the advent of the printing press. And then things like fresco and the sculpture that I mentioned in many different materials, stone, wood, and sometimes on a smaller scale, sculpture made out of things like gold and gilt silver. And even things that would have been used in daily life. We have chess pieces up here. We have a whole deck of late 15th century playing cards.
Really?
So a whole kind of window into different aspects of medieval art and the kinds of things that people were engaged in during that period.
And would a lot of these pieces have been in private homes or
so
in
a mixture
churches?
Or many of them come out of churches, and especially in the wake of the French Revolution. A lot of churches were essentially dismantled, and monastic properties, the areas where monks and nuns were living, were also dissolved, so they were basically abandoned. Okay. And so that was one of the reasons that many of these things began coming onto the market in the 19th century, and George Gray Barnard and others were able to purchase fragments of medieval buildings and things like that. So a lot of the things here have, at their beginnings, a story that connects to the church.
Well, I also think a whole range of our society is represented here, because I've seen people from in their 90s, it looks like, to children. Tell me about the programs that are here.
It's definitely a multi-generational
It's everybody,
experience.
isn't it?
A lot of people love to come to the Cloisters to spend time with each other. Just in a beautiful
great date,
setting.
let me say. It's a great date
We
place.
have a lot of proposals
proposals here,
actually.
I believe it.
But we have organized programs on the weekends for families. We have tours every day of both the collections and the gardens.
Well, I know we're also going to see the world-class collection of Unicorn Tapestries.
Yeah, that's really one of the iconic parts of the collection is the Unicorn Tapestries, and something that many people come here to the Cloisters just to see those works themselves.
But I'm sure they're pleasantly surprised to see what else is here.
Absolutely.
If that's all they're coming to see.
Yeah, there's a lot to see, but those are certainly maybe one of the more famous works of art in the collection.
So tell me about the journey of the Cloisters.
So the Cloisters actually goes back to 1925 in its association with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, when the Met purchased a collection that was put together by a man named George Gray Barnard, who was a sculptor and also a dealer of medieval art and architecture.
Was he American?
He was American, actually, and it was George Gray Barnard that assembled the core collections of what we now see here at the Cloisters. And he shipped all of these things here to New York City in 1914, just before the First World War broke out.
So he had been collecting them in Europe?
He'd been collecting them in Europe. He assembled a significant body of material, shipped it here to New York, and he opened a private museum, which he actually called the Cloisters, about 1.5 miles to the south of where we are now, just at the beginning of the south end of Fort Tryon Park, which at that time didn't exist.
So had the Met decided at that point that they were not going to stay in that location? Was it too small? Or?
Yeah, it's an interesting story, actually. George Gray Barnard built this purpose-built museum to house the things that he had collected. And then when the Met purchased the land and the building and the collections in 1925, John D. Rockefeller Jr. actually reserved the right to relocate the collection to a new site, because he was in the process at that time of buying up land here in what would become Fort Tryon Park. And he always held out a vision of this building being created within a park-like setting, so that that sense of solitude and beauty that's an important part of the experience here would be part of the history of the building.
Well, I thought I had heard that Rockefeller also purchased property across the Hudson River so that the view would be preserved. Is that true?
Yeah, he did. I mean, he's someone who really,
visionary.
Definitely a visionary, and he really valued that experience of being in a city like New York, but still having the kind of natural beauty of the geology and the topography of this very special site. We're up here on a high ridge. You look across to the Palisades, and Rockefeller really had a long-term vision of making sure that that would remain as pristine as possible.
Well, how long did this actually take to build then?
So the construction began in the middle of the 1930s, so the heart of the Great Depression. It's an amazing thing to imagine.
Yeah.
The building was opened in 1938 in the way that we see it now, and at that same time Rockefeller gave the land that became Fort Tryon Park, and it's an Olmsted design park, so it's the same firm that worked on Central Park.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Well, now we're here, and we're in this fantastic chapel. Tell me where we're standing.
So we're standing in a space that when the Cloisters first opened was an exhibition space, but then in the 1950s, the Cloisters started negotiations with the Spanish government to purchase what was a standing apse, a standing architectural structure in a region of Spain called Segovia. And that apse behind us, that large architectural structure.
So the apse is the archway?
Is
or
the
what's
archway
beyond?
and everything behind that.
I see, okay.
It's about 3,200 individual stones that were disassembled. And they're actually not owned by the Met. They're a permanent loan from the Spanish government. That was part of the negotiations that took place in the 50s. And so it opened in the way that we see it now in the 1960s. And this is a space that we use to display the collections, but there's also concerts that take place here at the Cloisters.
The acoustics must be incredible.
Fantastic
when you
acoustics
walk
in here, especially for voice, you know, for people who are singing without accompaniment or without the addition of mainly amplification. You just don't need speakers in a space like this because it's so resonant. I mean, the stone was really made to resonate with the voices of in those days, the priests that would hold the divine office around the high altar, which used to be part of that structure.
It's just stunning, and this crucifix is beautiful. Tell me why it's hanging. You don't usually, and also I noticed that Christ's eyes are open.
Yeah.
You usually see a more pained
right,
expression.
Exactly. The whole idea there is that you're seeing Christ triumphant over death. So the idea in sculptures like that is that Christ is being depicted not as a suffering human, but as a triumphant figure who is conquering death, and therefore his eyes are open, and he's actually wearing a crown if you look carefully at his head.
Oh, you're right, yes.
And he's made of wood, but he's painted, so there's a very realistic level of detail. So the wood would have been painted in flesh tones and the kinds of colors you're seeing, and he's hanging because in the Middle Ages, especially in the late 12th century, you would have had crucifixes like that hanging usually right between the area where the apse is and the area where we're standing, which we can think of as the nave of a church.
And why would it be hanging for?
Just so that it's present to remind people what's being celebrated on the altar, what's being commemorated.
And is it decorated on the back side?
It is. It's actually decorated on both sides.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful piece.
With the way the Cloisters is set up, you can actually walk through the galleries in a chronological sequence. So you're going from the early part of the medieval period up through the later period, which we would think of as right up on the border with the Renaissance. So most of the material that's on view in this gallery we would consider Romanesque, which is named after a period of medieval art that dates from about the 12th to the 13th centuries. And then as you move through the galleries, you move forward in time.
Well, I know we're going to go to the late Gothic gallery next,
Yes.
so why don't we head in that direction?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure to share
Thanks
that
so
with everyone.
much.
Yeah.
I remember studying this piece in art history. It's one of my favorites. Let's talk about this.
Sure, we're looking at the Merode Altarpiece, which was painted around the year 1430.
1430?
Yeah, and it's one of the great early Netherlandish paintings in America, probably. The subject, as you can see, is the Annunciation, but what makes this so unique for its time is that the Annunciation is given to us in a version that's rendered in contemporary language. So it's taking place, even though it's an event from the Gospels, in an interior that would have looked like an early 15th century person's home.
Yes. And also there's space, there's depth.
Yes, there's definitely an attempt to render depth so that we get this sense that the space that we're looking into is really an extension of the space that we're in, rather than another world. And it's that sense of connection between our world and the world that we're looking at that was so innovative when this was first made. The other thing that's really unusual about this for its time is that it's in oil paint. And this is one of the first moments that a generation of painters, particularly in Northern Europe, are really beginning to master this new technique of oil painting.
And were they creating they were making their own pigment, I guess.
Yeah, they're grinding
had to
their
have
own
been laborious.
pigments, and yeah, very time intensive. But what oil paint offered them was an ability to replicate details of the natural world, the world around us, in a way that really emphasized the sense of verisimilitude, this kind of accuracy. So you get things like the ceramic that's on the table has the quality, the reflective characteristics of ceramic.
It does.
You've got those wisps of smoke that are coming up from the candle that's just been extinguished, probably by the arrival of Gabriel. It's this kind of divine wind that blows out the candle.
Through that little window up there on the left?
And then in the window on the left, you see the figure of Christ holding a cross coming down through. So this is the moment just before the conception. And we're actually witnessing this event before Mary, who's in red, realizes what's happening. She's still engrossed in the book that she's reading.
Well, and look at the technique in the clothing. Oh my God, I mean, the fabrics are beautiful.
All those details, the fabrics, there's little gems that are actually on Gabriel's, on the blue portion of his garment. And then looking in on the left are the donors who would have commissioned the painting in the first place.
Oh,
so the man in
interesting.
black is the patron who would have ordered this picture to have been made. So he's looking at himself, looking at this scene of the Annunciation.
And tell me what's on the right-hand panel
so on the
here.
right-hand side is Joseph, depicted not necessarily as a carpenter, but much more kind of elevated. He's actually making mouse traps. In fact, on the table in front of him is a mouse trap.
Oh, I see it, yes.
And St. Augustine is someone who refers to the cross as the devil's mousetrap. So there's a lot of hidden symbolism in this painting.
And that seems to be the case in a lot of the art of this era.
Especially of this period, yeah. It looks like a scene that is very straightforward on the surface, but often the more that you peel away, it's kind of like an onion. There are many, many layers.
And would this have been in the patron's home?
Yeah, you want to imagine this being in a domestic setting, so a setting not unlike the one that we're looking at, and this was used in their daily devotions. And if you're a newly married couple, which this couple was, you're probably very interested in the Annunciation, in part because you're probably hoping yourself for children.
Start a family,
So,
yeah. Well, it's a beautiful piece. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on it.
Oh, you're welcome.
So here we are, the Unicorn Tapestries. Tell me about what we're seeing here.
Sure. Well, this is actually a set of tapestries that were probably made around the year 1500. And what's interesting about them is two things. One is that they survive in really great condition.
Yeah.
And considering the fact that all the dyes that are being used on these tapestries are organic, it's a very fugitive color. So
wait a minute, when you say organic, like from plants?
Yeah, so there are 3 plants that give them all the colors that they're using to dye the threads that are being used to create the colors that we're seeing. So it's kind of hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
A set of tapestries like this might have taken as much as 15 years to make. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of labor and time to create these kinds of objects. And the story that's featured is the story of the hunt for the unicorn. And the kind of iconic image is of the unicorn in captivity. And when you look at that tapestry, it looks like the unicorn has blood on its back, but in fact that red is actually from the pomegranate fruit that is in the tree up above. And once you begin thinking about the fruits and the vegetation that are depicted in the tapestries, it's the case that about 80 different plant species have been identified by botanists in these tapestries, and many of them connect to themes of love and fertility. So one idea is that the Unicorn Tapestries were commissioned to celebrate the occasion of an important marriage. And that's why you have these two letters that keep reappearing in the tapestries, the A and the backwards E, because they might be connected to the union of these two families that are being commemorated in the creation of the tapestry series.
I'm sure the simplicity of this design kind of belies a very complex process.
Yeah, these are incredibly time intensive to make. All of the individual colors that you see are dyed threads. So it's sort of like think of it as a painting in thread. And some of the greatest artists of their day would have been commissioned to make the designs for these tapestries. And then whole workshops of people would have been involved in executing those designs to make what we're actually looking at. Stirling Castle in Scotland made a series of replicas of these tapestries, and it took three weavers, two teams of three weavers, 15 years to do that work. So that gives
using
you
the
some
same
sense.
techniques, dyeing them with plant material, and wow.
Yeah, so these are definitely things that would have been incredibly expensive and also very high status objects in their day.
Now I noticed that they're protected in the sense that the lighting is rather dim in here, and is that intentional?
It's definitely intentional, because one of the things about tapestries in particular is that all the colors are based on plant dyes. So those tend to be very fugitive. So much like watercolor, which fades in natural light, so too will tapestries. So we keep the light levels very low in here so that we can preserve these for posterity as much as possible.
Well, and speaking of lighting, I noticed throughout the cloisters that there seems to be less artificial light and more natural light.
Yeah, there's a lot of spaces at the cloisters which open up onto the outside, and the natural light is really critical for lighting the stained glass, but it also allows us to show things like sculpture, especially sculpture that would have been exterior sculpture in a setting that is sympathetic to how it was made. The other thing that's so nice about the cloisters is that movement between the gardens and the galleries. It's really a nice rhythm that you can get into as you explore the museum itself, because you're moving inside and then outside and back inside.
Well, not only is this museum an incredible structure, but what's in it is just a treasure trove. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today and all of your knowledge, too.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure.
Thanks,
really glad to have
Christian.
you up here.
Thanks again. So you have to explain to me, what is this gorgeous garden? Do you even call it a garden?
This is our central kind of main ornamental garden.
Ornamental garden, okay.
It's really the first, for the most people that come to the museum, it's the first garden that they encounter. So it's designed to be overall ornamental, like a beautiful garden, but it very much takes its cues from a medieval pleasure garden.
So would any of the gardens ever mix the medicinal plants with the pleasure plants, with the industrial plants, or?
No, it's a good question. It's the pleasure garden very much, there would be no distinction in the pleasure garden. The reason to be would be plants that, pleasure the senses, excite the, things that kind of have that
or visually,
beautiful flowers, color, fragrance. Fragrance is always a very big one. Great example is the lavender that we're standing in front of.
That is healthy lavender.
We still exalt it for its fragrance. In the Middle Ages, it was both, they saw it as both a beautiful plant, but very much a useful plant. They would use it to scent linens, to repel moths.
Just like today.
Just like today.
I mean, you see dried lavender in sachets all the time, which is... And was there normally a focal point, such as this fountain that you have here?
There is. We say this garden, the design of this garden, we always say is typically medieval. It's not based on any specific design, but you see this overall design kind of reflected in all of our gardens, which is this dividing of four, which is very reflective of the medieval world view, which saw the world being made up as four elements. 4 seasons,
is that the idea?
And 4 humors, exactly.
Oh.
Also the layout of the paths kind of represent a cross. In the center you have the fountain, which is like a circular water feature. Also the sky was represented, kind of the bowl of the sky, or the circle would represent the heavens. So the cloister was laid out in very much a rectangular form or square form. It's kind of very much represents the profane or the earthly. And the bowl of the sky, or the circle of the sky, very much represented the heavens. Kind of.
I'm sure you're very busy in the fall here. How do you put these gardens to sleep for the winter?
We're busy year round.
I believe it, yeah.
But there's a lot of big tasks that take place in the garden during the fall. We're cutting all the perennials back, pulling out some of the annuals that are mixed in, and then in kind of that space that we create, we're doing a lot of bulb planting for the spring.
Oh yeah.
And if you come here, if you've been here early spring, really starting as early as March, you'll see that the turfs, the little lawns that are planted underneath the trees, will kind of come alive with all tiny little ephemerals, crocuses, and
fun to see,
irises.
right?
Yeah, so it's very much a tapestry of colors. So.
Well, I've decided as a home gardener, and I'm sure as a professional, you have to have an optimistic attitude towards your garden. I kind of thought at the beginning you just plant everything and it takes care of itself, and whoa,
right.
30 years later.
No, that would
it's a lot of transplanting.
That would put us out of work, I guess. You'd have to, no, it's very much gardening is very much a daily task.
Yeah.
And we do, it's a pretty common question that we get in the gardens, like, what do you do in the winters? And basically, say we catch up, we breathe, we do.
Yeah, you exhale, right.
Exactly. We kind of, in keeping with having the gardens be very much reflective of kind of the museum as a whole, as kind of celebrating medieval culture, medieval art. We very much do deck the halls during what would be a very important feast time, the medieval Christmastide feast.
Sure.
So we're using a lot of plant materials. So let's take a peek behind the scenes here a little bit. This is a...
oh, what is this space? It's so cool.
Isn't it? This is our Bonifant Shed. It's our...
Okay, is this a work area for the horticulturals?
It's very much a work area.
So tell me, what is this, Caleb?
This is a bit of last year's garlic.
Oh, garlic,
so
wow.
We grew out in the vegetable bed. We recognize it, we use it in the same way they did in the Middle Ages, but it was pretty powerful medicine as well. But it also had something that's kind of preserved in modern lore, which is this powerful ability to ward off evil, right?
Oh, interesting.
It's an atropopaic plant, and you see that preserved and kind of to ward off vampires, right? In that story, and it would be done very much in the same way, where you would hang these cloves up around your house.
Almost for protection.
For protection,
yeah.
exactly, or for blessing.
Tell me what these are up here. Oh, this is so
we have
pretty.
We have some cool thistle heads.
Oh, wow. Those
right,
are
be
great.
careful of that.
Whoa,
I think this one is actually from the milk thistle, which we're growing in the gardens, and you can see.
Oh, so sweet.
That some of these thistles, this is really an example of medieval ingenuity. You got to be careful.
That is really
they'll let you know.
That is such a strong color. Is this the type of dye that would be used for artists, that artists would use for tapestries or stained glass maybe even, or?
The St. John's wort could be. It wasn't the most popular of the vegetable dyes, so not the most widely used. If you saw the Unicorn Tapestries,
Yeah,
in one of the
we
galleries
did,
earlier. Those were dyed with 3 main vegetable dyes. And we have a number of these so they can be used. You know, we harvest these and they can be used as these teaching tools that shows the dyed wool.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is actually the root.
So what is this area here? This looks like the real work area.
Yeah, we have some more tools. It's very much
Tools of the trade, right?
functional
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
We have both the cuttings, but we also have.
Oh, it's so organized.
Yeah, this one's pretty neat.
Oh, that looks Japanese
Wow.
almost.
It does, but it's very, very similar to what medieval
Whoa.
shovels. Yeah, right inside, just inside the museum, there's actually the sculpture of Saint Fiacre, who is the patron saint of gardeners, and he's holding a little shovel, kind of like this.
They didn't have long
and
handles?
it looks just like this. It has this triangular form. We like them because they're actually pretty good for working in around tight spaces.
And tell me about these baskets, these inverted baskets above us.
Those are little basket, like little woven cloches, actually.
And what purpose do they serve? They're not for over
So
like
they
a cake.
Exactly. You're probably more familiar with them now from these images of like 19th century French market gardens where you see these beautiful glass cloches covering, making kind of little mini greenhouses, basically. Well, they didn't have that in the Middle Ages, but they did something quite similar, as they would protect with baskets like this.
While the plant was growing,
the same way in the garden, exactly. From the harshest of the elements, really. Plants just need a little extra protection. So if you're growing and setting out something, or transplanting, which is what we most generally use them for, if it's a hot day like today.
Thank you so much for sharing this space with us. I know it's a treat for everyone.
It is, yeah. It's kind of a little, it's fun to get
It's a hide. It's definitely a hideaway.
Yeah. Our workshop.
Well, I can see I have a lot of work to do in my own garden, so thank you.
Good.
Thank you again. Okay. So did you ever think you could explore the wonders of medieval Europe right here in New York City? I know I didn't. The Cloisters really is an oasis of serenity and inspiration. Be sure it's on your must-see list of American museums. Thanks for joining us on Museum Access. I'm Leslie Mueller. See you next time.